Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Craftcast. We've made it all the way to Series 4 of Craftcast, the Freemasons podcast. I'm James, and I'm joined, prematurely jumping in there, by...
Stephen.
And...
Sean.
Brethren, how are we doing today?
I'm fine. Rather not talk about my prematurity, but all good.
And Sean?
Oh, dear. What a way to start season 4. Yes, very well. Thank you, James. All good. Very excited for today's interview. It's someone that we've wanted to get for a while, isn't it?
It is. We're going to be interviewing a very special guest to talk to us about probably one of the most famous criminal cases in history.
I think James, the most famous.
Yeah, which I'm extremely excited about. But before we get into that, what have we been up to in the gap between Series 3 and 4? What are we up to at the moment, brethren?
Well, I am now, as of now, the master of Letchworth Lodge, number 3505.
Congratulations.
Stephen, we had a great night, didn't we?
Yes, it was lovely to see you there.
Oh, don't make me feel guilty because I couldn't make it. I feel really bad.
For my fellow Craftcast host.
You know, if Stephen Watley is traveling international waters to be there.
Oh, where are you coming from, Stephen? Sorry, where did you come from?
Germany, Frankfurt, Germany.
Oh, you were not in Gibraltar, no?
No, actually, not.
Weird. I feel like something's wrong.
Stephen, how have you been?
Well, I have had a long and fairly restful Christmas break. Been writing up my research. Everyone's probably been following how many episodes I've been writing up my research now.
Been going on for quite a while, Stephen.
You know, Stephen, rarely does a day go by when I don't think about what you just said.
He can't even say it.
So it is quite interesting. It's quite novel. So it is taking quite a bit of research, to be fair. And how are you, James? We do care, I promise.
Oh, thank you so much, Stephen. I'm very well. We are currently recording this virtually, one of the few episodes we've done virtually, although hopefully our listeners can't tell the difference, because I'm currently sat in Bloomington, Indiana, in the United States for a 6:00 recording session in the morning with you guys. But do you know, I can't think of a better way to spend my morning than talking to my two colleagues.
Your level of commitment is honorable.
The things I do for this show. So yes,
I'm
in the
James,
US.
I can share a way that you can improve that experience, actually.
Yeah.
I think the way that you make that better is by diving into the murky world of Victorian London.
Yeah.
Particularly the streets of Whitechapel in 1888, to uncover the secrets around one of Britain, if not the world's, most renowned serial killers.
Yes, I can't wait to get into this. Jack the Ripper, one of, if not the most famous murder case and crime in history. I've been wanting to do this for such a long time. So...
what a way to kick off. Let's go, guys.
Shall we get into it?
Let's do it. So, everybody, I'm delighted to share with you that today we are very lucky to be joined by someone who is probably familiar to a number of you, and someone who we've been very keen to get onto Craftcast for a long time, Mike Neville. Now, Mike Neville is a Freemason and a retired Scotland Yard Detective Chief Inspector. He is an expert on the history of the craft and history of crime, and as a result travels the world assisting police forces and also giving lectures in lodges. Mike is a world-renowned for his ability to catch criminals with CCTV using super recognizer officers. And many of you will also know that Mike is the author of a number of Masonic books, and all of these are available to you to check out on Amazon. So I encourage you to go and do that. Mike, thank you very much for being with us today.
Pleasure. It's good to be here.
Great. So just as a way of introduction to this as a topic, being responsible for comms for UGLE, I have to say, in 2025, I spend an inordinate amount of time talking to the press about a case from 1888. And a lot more, to be honest with you, than I think anyone would otherwise reasonably expect. So, Mike, I guess the obvious place to start would be, where did this all begin, and why is there so much interest in this as a case and as something that is relevant today?
Well, Jack the Ripper was the world's first sexual serial killer. And of course, there's all sorts of theories about who it is. So no one knows. So the intrigue starts there, really, that firstly, the manner of the crime and the fact it's never been solved. So that's the interest there. Then you get all sorts of bizarre theories banded around. You have Stephen Knight's book, The Final Solution, which claimed there was a Masonic conspiracy. But that's easily disproved because the three people he accused of being involved, only one of them, as we'll probably mention later, the commissioner of the police, was a Mason. And then more recently, you've had Johnny Depp in the film From Hell, which portrays much of the same sort of story. And so Freemasonry gets dragged into this. But I can honestly say that I've really researched this, and I've found about 60 Masons from 40 lodges involved in this case, who are police officers, doctors, detectives, coroners, suspects, all sorts of things, just as we'd expect in Victorian England. But what we can say as a more general thing is that there's far more good Freemasons than there is at bad. And throughout the time, Freemasons have been involved in the development of forensic science and have done far more to advance the law enforcement than they've ever done to commit crime. But the Jack the Ripper story will just run and will always get more interest.
Mike, I think it's interesting you talked about Victorian society there. I recently watched your Freemasons Without Borders webinar that you did during COVID on this very subject. And I was particularly struck by the statement you made that it was quite fashionable to be a Freemason back in that period, which would probably logically explain why so many of the medical professionals and the investigating police officers were members of the craft, because it was just a fashionable thing to do at the time.
Not like us layabouts nowadays, eh?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, because of course the Grand Master was the Prince of Wales, who went on to be Edward VII, and then his son Prince Albert Victor was the provincial Grand Master of Berkshire at the time, and he's dragged into it because he's allegedly the reason for this conspiracy, that he illegally married a Roman Catholic girl and had children, and then the prostitutes somehow decided to bribe him. So that comes into it as well. But it is the fact that it was very fashionable. And at the time of the Prince of Wales, in the 25 years he was the Grand Master, the number of lodges increased fourfold. So more and more people were in Freemasonry. So the fact there's a lot of Freemasons involved in this investigation, they're involved in every major investigation or major incident of that Victorian time.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting you said about 60 Masons. I guess that's what you get from, I mean, I don't know how many people, do you know how many people are involved in general in this whole process? But I imagine it's just an average cross-section of people.
Well, yeah, so it's 40 Masons I've found in 60 lodges, because some are in two and three lodges. But
I mean, overall, as in how many people overall might have been involved, like hundreds, thousands?
Thousands of people.
Yeah, so I mean, to take 40 people from, 2,000 or 3,000, let's say, that's really not very much.
But what I can say, Stephen, is the level. So if you look at the police, for example, we know that the Metropolitan Police at the time, the Commissioner of the Police, he was a Freemason, Sir Charles Warren. What they call then the Chief Constable of the police, of the CID, this Criminal Investigation Department, he was also a Freemason, albeit he was old and he didn't really take part in the investigation. But the key man, the what we would call today the senior investigating officer, was Donald Swanson. He would be like an equivalent of me, DCI Donald Swanson. He was a Scottish craft mason and a London Mark Mason. And then we also have Fred Aberline. Fred Aberline is probably the most celebrated of everybody. He was like the equivalent of today's detective inspector. He was sent to the scene. So he's the man who's played by Michael Caine as a sort of alcoholic, and by Johnny Depp as a drug addict who kills himself. And he's then subject to there's a Masonic trial because they tried to kill him and all this stuff. But the nonsense of it all is, of course, that the real Fred Aberline was neither an alcoholic or drug addict, but he was a Freemason. He joined a year later. This is never mentioned. He joined the Zetland Lodge a year later. And just to show the utter nonsense of it, that about 20 years ago, a plaque was put on his house where he lived in Bournemouth, and it said on there that and his early retirement may have been forced on him by Freemasons. Well, it must be in his own lodge putting his arm up his back or something. So what gets me is I look for evidence. I was a senior detective. I look for evidence. And what I see is that there were lots of Freemasons trying to catch Jack the Ripper. So if, for example, the very first offender profile where you try and describe the killer was made by Dr. Thomas Bond, a Freemason at the time. Some of the most junior officers, Fred Wensley, went on to form the flying squad, the Sweeney, that many people have seen on the TV. He was a Freemason and became the head of the CID. Why would he ever join Freemasonry later in life if he thought there was Masonic involvement? Likewise, the man who took photographs of Mary Kelly's eyes, they were so basic, their knowledge of forensic science, they thought if they took a photograph of the dead woman's eyes, it would reveal what she last saw. Well, the man who took that photograph was Detective Constable Walter June, who went on again to be a Middlesex Freemason and also famously crossed the Atlantic and caught Crippen, who was captured because of a telegraph invented by a Freemason. So you can see all these people are involved in this case, not to get Jack the Ripper off. These are people who wanted to catch the Ripper. Fred Wensley, who, as I said, invented the Sweeney. He actually nailed bicycle tires to his hobnail boots as a young PC so he could creep around the East End. He's an innovator from the start. So all these people were keen to have this man arrested. And what we know from Swanson's theory is that he may well have identified him as Kosminski.
There's a prevailing sort of urban legend that Jack the Ripper, whoever he actually was himself, may have been a Freemason. And I understand that this has come about because of the message that was written on the wall at the site of one of the murders. It wasn't photographed, but it was written down. And without spoiling anything, that's sort of a subtle reference to one of our ceremonies, or it could be interpreted that way, even though we don't think it is. And that's part of where this may have come from. If you could just talk to us about that.
Yes, of course. So on the 30th of September, 1888, there was what was called the double event, where a woman called Liz Stride was murdered. She was murdered in the Metropolitan Police District. For those who know London policing, there is a very small force called the City of London right in the middle, and they're separate. It's like a big donut, really, or a polo mint. The rest is done by the Metropolitan Police. It would seem that Jack the Ripper was disturbed there and fled in through Aldgate into the City of London police area, where in a place called Mitre Square, he murdered Catherine Eddowes and brutally cut her up, cut a piece of her apron off, removed one of her kidneys and slashed her face. He then ran back through Aldgate, over probably what's known called Petticoat Lane, and back into the Metropolitan Police District. About an hour after the murder, a police constable found the piece of apron, which appeared to have been wiped, a knife, because it had blood on it. And on the wall was some words, the Jews, which is spelled Jewes, Jewes, are the men who will not be blamed for nothing. Now, the Masonic conspiracy theory is that Sir Charles Warren, who was initiated in Gibraltar, who became the commissioner of the police after being an officer in the engineers, ordered it to be wiped off. Well, but the reason it was wiped off is that you had a detective constable from the city police who is now in the Metropolitan Police area who says, I want to photograph those words. The superintendent of Whitechapel, who wasn't a Freemason, said, well, I don't want those words on that wall because it'll cause anti-Semitic riots, so wash them off. So he made a copy. So Charles Warren turned up, who is the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and the two men put their case to him. And of course, he backs up the superintendent, who's a senior officer and a member of his own police force. But firstly, if it was that much of a secret, why did they ever allow it to be written down? They would have washed it up and not recorded what it said, but they didn't do that. And also the actual story, it's alleged that Jewes, by Stephen Knight says this is some kind of collective known for three murderers, but there's no evidence of that either. So it becomes an entire fiction. And again, if you watch From Hell, you see Johnny Depp looking at this in the ritual as Fred Aberline. Well, he must have enjoyed it because, as I said, he went on to join a year later. So there we go.
And of course, he's referencing those three murderers. But any Freemason listening that knows what we're talking about here, the names of those three murderers isn't really mentioned in English Masonic ritual. It's more continental and US based. So even if Jack the Ripper was a Mason, he probably wouldn't have come across those names anyway.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. They're nothing to do with English ritual. And the whole conspiracy theory, as I say, can be kicked into touch. It's alleged that the people involved were Sir Charles Warren. That's number one. So we know he was a Freemason. Then Lord Salisbury, who was the Prime Minister at the time, he wasn't a Mason. And then Sir William Gull, who was the Queen's surgeon, he wasn't a Freemason either. So it's portrayed in these films. People just believe what they say and see on these movies. But as I say, I've researched this, and the vast majority of the Freemasons I've found are the ones who were trying to catch him. There are some Masons who are suspects. So look at Frederick Deeming. He's long been a suspect, a very violent man who slashed his family's throats, dug a hole in the kitchen in the house in Lancashire, buried them, cemented over. Then he went to Australia, found time to join a lodge there. This is researched by my great friend Peter Reeve. No one knew he was a Mason before this. Killed his wife on Christmas Day, slashed her throat, dug a hole in the kitchen, buried her, cemented over. But he was eventually captured. He was arrested by a Freemason. It's amazing, in the 1890s by now, he could send a telegraph to the Yard. Scotland Yard sent a telegraph to Lancashire. It was a Mason who was a superintendent, and the sergeant, the Mason who dug up the hole in Lancashire, found the bodies there and convicted him. So it just shows that there are bad Masons, like there are bad Catholic priests or bad scout leaders or bad politicians, but the vast majority of people in any big organization are good, decent people. And there was a lot of good, decent Freemasons who were trying to catch Jack the Ripper. And as we say, there's many theories. Aberline named a man called Kalowski, who was arrested by his colleague, Sergeant Godley, also a Freemason, and that he named Kalowski. He wasn't a Mason. And Donald Swanson, the senior investigating officer, named Kosminski, who's one who often features in the newspapers. And I have to say, if I was a detective chief inspector in charge of that case, both of those men would have been in the cells, and both have been questioned. And both weren't Masons, but that would have been of no consequence at all.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Mike. I mean, the recent coverage of the case seems to be focusing, basically claiming, and I'm sure you'll be able to shed some light on this, claiming that DNA evidence has now basically connected Kosminski to the crime. And then another book has been published recently which claimed that apparently Kosminski's brother was a Mason or something or other, and that therefore that was proof that, I mean, it's so tenuous, it's almost laughable. But is that case closed? If we found Jack the Ripper, is Kosminski the killer, do we think?
No. So let me talk about contact trace evidence. So in 1888, the police had no understanding of contact trace, i.e., if I touch something, then it would I would leave some kind of trace behind. We have to go to like 1902, the first fingerprint case, and 1905, the first murder case solved by fingerprints. That the police understand if you touch something, it makes a difference. And of course, it was a Freemason, Charles Stockley Collins, who was the very first expert fingerprint officer. But going back to 1888, they didn't understand this. So when Catherine Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square, she was examined by Dr. Frederick Brown, the City of London police surgeon, who was, of course, a Freemason. He's the one who found the kidney missing. But it's alleged that it's her shawl that's been found. And this shawl is never recorded. Even today in the police, they record what you got in your pockets when you get arrested, because you've been in the cells in Bishopsgate Police Station before being released, and then she was murdered. It's never recorded that she had this shawl, but that's not unusual because they don't record the clothes. But even if this shawl did belong to her, then it's been touched by 1,000 people, because there was no understanding that if you touched it, it made a difference, as I said, until about 1902. And also, the DNA match, what they say, they found semen on there, which matches a distant relative of Kosminski's today, and they found blood on there, which matches a distant relative of Eddowes today. The thing is, it's mitochondrial DNA. That's DNA that's passed from mother to mother to mother. Got this line down. and it's a 1 in 10,000 match. Now, to give you an idea, if I went to murder trial today and took a suspect to the Old Bailey, the evidence produced would be that this is a 1 in a billion match. That's the difference. Why we think Kosminski is a suspect is because Donald Swanson, the senior investigating officer, he named him. The assistant commissioner wrote a book where he said, unsolved murders are very rare, and Jack the Ripper is not one of them, but I cannot name the suspect. Because Donald Swanson was given that book as a gift and wrote in pencil that it was Kosminski was the suspect. So that's a good starting point. So he is a good suspect, but this DNA evidence is fatally flawed and would never be accepted in court.
I mean, I was just going to say, as soon as you said that, so I mean, my background in science and in biochemistry, I was just like, how on earth do they think they can match something from a descendant of it and match to a descendant? That's just insane.
It gives us an indication, the very first familial DNA, where, in modern policing, if you get a DNA sample from a weapon or something, you can, if you don't find the person on the database, you look for the next nearest because it could be a relative. Now, the very first case of this was a man called Harmon who dropped a block off the M3 gantry and killed a lorry driver, and he was actually a Freemason who solved that case. That's a lot further down the line. That's in the 1990s. That's Nick Mitchell, who's a Yorkshire Mason. So Freemasons, we've been at the forefront of forensic developments. Sir Bernard Spilsbury in the 10s, 20s, 30s was the most famous pathologist who brides in the bath, who discovered the way to test for arsenic. Sir William Wilcox, who designed the very first ever test. It wasn't until 1911 we could say that blood is human, not a mammal. William Wilcox, Freemason. First fingerprint expert, Charles Stockley Collins. So we've been right at the forefront of doing all this. So, yeah, Jack the Ripper's fascinating, but it's not everything to do with Masonry.
Mike, there's one interesting story that I've heard of in the past. I think you referenced it in one of your online talks I've watched, but I forget the details, so please fill us in, of a case where a Mason was charged with, I think it was murder, went to court, and when he was appearing before the judge for sentencing, he gave a Masonic mode of recognition to the judge, who actually made a point of calling that out in the sentencing and say that this is not what Freemasonry is about. And you've referenced in your talk about Jack the Ripper now about how it was Masons who were trying to catch this guy, not support him.
Yeah,
I think that speaks to the morality of the organization. But could you just tell us a bit more about that sentencing case?
Yes, of course. So that case was in 1912. It was a case of Frederick Seddon, who was from Liverpool, who was a Freemason there. Came down as a Freemason in Buckinghamshire, settled in London, and he was a kind of sort of greedy insurance man, really, and he liked gold coins, and he fell in with Eliza Barrow, who owned the Buck's Head pub in Camden Market. If you ever go there, the landlord knows the story. And basically, he asked her, he said, look, you've got all these coins and gold coins and worries and properties. Come and live in my house. Of course, we'll feed you every day. We'll give you an allowance every week. And we'll look after you for as long as you live, which, of course, is not very long at all. He bumped her off with arsenic, and he was, of course, the case against him was, the arsenic was proved by Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who did that test for the Crippen case. So a Mason proved the evidence there, and he appeared at the Old Bailey in front of Sir Thomas Bucknell, who was the provincial Grand Master of Surrey at the time. And when he was found not guilty, he made a Masonic plea to the judge. By the great architect of the universe, I am not guilty of this crime. And the judge was upset by this, but what he said is, our brotherhood condemns crime. It does not condone it. Of course, sentenced him to death. And that, to me, is the ultimate case. And I can speak of more recent cases where judges have told me that somebody's tried to make Masonic signs, and do you know what? They've ended up with more time in prison because of the way they behaved. So that just sums up that Freemasonry is a force for good.
Well, I think that you see that often if someone approaches, I don't know, a lodge or anyone who's a Mason, and you can clearly tell they're joining for the wrong reasons, you'll immediately want to put them off joining. It's not even like, well, okay, you could try somewhere else. You're just like, well, I don't think it's for you. Yeah. And you'll just sort of just explain what it is about and what it isn't about. So I can fully imagine that I think if any one of us found that someone was trying to use their masonry in a professional life to try and get a leg up or to further their private or mercenary interests, as it were, that wouldn't fly, basically.
I think we're more. I think Grand Lodge has got to be congratulated on being more vociferous in her defence now and calling things out. So you saw it recently with The Gold, the BBC series with Kenneth Noy, that it was portrayed as Kenneth Noy in his Masonic regalia, making all these corrupt meetings. The reality is, I had the minute books from that lodge. I was given them, so I knew exactly how many meetings he'd been to. He was in for about 4.5 years, went for 11 meetings. And he was mentioned when he was initiated, passed and raised and got his Grand Lodge certificate. That's the end of the matter. And what rather summed up the sort of banalness of it all was that while he was fencing some, £20 million worth of bullion, the lodge secretary and treasurer were in a year-long dispute about a £7 increase on the subs. So that was what they recorded in the minutes, and it just sums it up. But I think we've got to call it out and say this is not right. And I think Grand Lodge is really taking Sean, of course, and his colleagues are really forcing these things. And I think it's right. We should argue back and say this is nonsense. We are force for good. And as I say, with law enforcement, we have done such good work. Masons have been at the forefront of British policing, has been at the forefront of the developments of how we catch criminals, and many of those people have been Masons.
Good old Freemasonry never changes, arguing about a £7 increase in subs. But back to specifically on Jack the Ripper, am I right in thinking that this is purely sensationalized, that the actual evidence is purely circumstantial for literally any candidate, any suspect?
There are names, some people are named. So Donald Swanson, as I've said, has named a suspect. Aberline named a suspect. There's reasons for all these things. But one of the things I would go back to is you've got to look at the standard of evidence at the time. When we say, the body was taken by ambulance to a mortuary, we expect a highly a green and yellow, highly clean vehicle to take a body to a mortuary, which looks like something off Silent Witness, all shiny and steel and all this. Really, it was at the time, it was a hand-pushed cart to a rickety old shed. And the coroner at the time, Wynne Baxter, who was a Sussex and London Mason, he heavily criticised the facilities available. But not only that, he criticised the police and basically called them bungling and stupid. So it's nice to know nothing much has changed. But many of the Masons, many of the police he criticised were Masons, but he didn't hold back. He didn't bother if somebody was a Mason or not. He just said the way this investigation has been conducted basically is not good enough. So he's another evidence against the idea of any Masonic conspiracy, because he was there to say this isn't the way that investigation should progress.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, just to finish up, Mike, because I know that you're very busy. Looking back during research for this interview, I found a new reference, a unique reference to Jack the Ripper and Freemasonry every year on Google News for the last 14 years. And it's probably just because that's as far as it goes back. I'm sure if it was allowed us to go back further, we probably would do. So I think that probably tells us that this isn't going anywhere. But that being said, I think us having conversations with experts like yourself, who in particular have focused in on the Masonic element of it, not the wider, that people make entire industries and lives out of Jack the Ripper and the case itself, but that particular Masonic element of it is, I think, a really good testament to us, as you say, sticking up for ourselves and speaking to you is an excellent way for us to do that. I guess really just to finish up, Mike, if somebody was listening and they would like to invite you along to give a talk or a presentation, how would they go about doing that?
They can look at my website, Mike Neville's Walks and Talks, or they can email me at mr, like Mr. Mike Neville, at AOL.com. The cost of the lecture is getting me there and a donation to a charity, whatever comes up. So if anybody's interested, not just Masons, but I do things for the Women's Institute and all sorts of NHS organisations, retired police, whatever the organisation is, widows associations in the Freemasons as well. So that's how they get hold of me.
Brilliant. Well, Mike, thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, thanks for shedding some light on one of the great mysteries of modern times.
A great pleasure. Thank you. And thank you, brethren.
So, James, Sean, what do we think? I was fascinated.
Yes, very much so. I have had an interest in Jack the Ripper since I went to London Dungeon when I was like 11. Which I know probably seems quite young to
I was
be
about
interested
11
in.
when I went as well.
Yeah, it's a good day out. But that was really what piqued my interest in the case. I do wonder, talking to Mike, actually, it seems to me it's probably never going to be solved, right? Like, we're
Yeah.
never going to know for sure.
I studied this at school as well, and that was the prevailing. Like, that's what you're taught. There is realistically no way you can't obtain the same evidence going, now as they have sort of falsely tried to with this DNA. Like, you just can't do it.
And I think really the message is loud and clear, as I hope, which is that good luck to those of you that want to dedicate your lives to trying to uncover the Ripper, but leave us out of it, guys. All right, you've had your Johnny Depp film, you've had your Michael Caine film, you've written your books. None of us are any the wiser. Let's just leave Freemasonry out of it. There's nothing to see here.
You know, the funniest line that I've seen from like any group chat or post or anything about Freemasonry, like, quote unquote, ruling the world, as they say, these nutters say, they go, "Oh, how on earth are we ruling the world if I'm struggling to get my email to work to send to all my members at 3 a.m.
Yes.
and I can't get the subscription fees off our latest member because they've forgotten to send them and I can't get hold of them." Like, we would be such an inefficient world ruling organization.
It's so true. I do love the fact that Mike was talking and very passionate about the fact that all the people trying to catch him, Freemasons were actually working to catch this guy.
Yeah.
Not to support him, not to cover up for him, but to actually catch him and bring him to justice.
Freemasonry was involved in this case, but on a very different side.
Absolutely. Involved in the right way.
Yeah. And I also think that's quite people go, "Oh, isn't it funny how he was also a Freemason?" Well, okay, you take like 1,000 people, maybe 40 of them will probably be Freemasons. Just at any period of history, you take a random selection of 1,000 Londoners and you'll probably get 40 Masons.
Especially then. Yeah, absolutely.
Especially then when the numbers were much higher per capita.
Yeah. So this is our first episode of the series, as we said at the beginning, and we left you at the end of series 3 with a present, didn't we, Sean?
That we did, Brother Dalton. If you remember, we put out something of a challenge to our loyal listeners where we asked you to send in suggestions for a future episode of Craftcast, and those of you that were successful, the individual that we most appreciated the suggestion, we would read out on the first episode of season 4. And not just that, we would also look to invite them in to record a future episode of the podcast. So, drum roll, please. I'm delighted to say, Gaz Taylor, you have been successful, and I will now read your email out for the benefit of everyone else. It says, "Hi, Sean, Stephen, and James."
Mr. Gaz Taylor.
Mr. Gaz Taylor, quite.
Yeah.
Hi, Sean, Stephen, and James. I hope I find you all well. I've recently started my application process to join the Freemasons, in particular the province of Lincolnshire, Ashlar Lodge, number 5219. I've had an interest in Freemasonry and the Knights Templar for over 30 years, but never really knew anyone who were Freemasons, or at least, if they were, never talked about it in a way that I may be invited. So I put it into the back of my mind. A recent visit to Roslin Chapel reinvigorated my curiosity. I began doing some online research. After a few hours of connecting very random dots, I found myself at the website of the Provincial Grand Lodge of Lincolnshire. From there, I found the online application, which I was very surprised to find. I was also always in the belief you had to be introduced. Roll forward 3 months. I've continued my application and personal research, avoiding all the misinformation and YouTube spoilers. On this journey, I've binged all 3 seasons of your excellent podcast. Additionally, I took the time to watch the UJLE series on Freemasonry. On one of your podcasts, you ask listeners to write in with suggestions, and your free series have covered a vast array of subjects, but one gap I believe you have is one that covers the journey of newly interested non-Freemasons. I would happily volunteer to take part in an episode and discuss my journey. For note, if all aligns, I hope to be initiated in April. Well, there you have it.
You are going to be on Craftcast, the Freemasons podcast, fresh out of the shrink wrap as a brand new Mason as well.
And I think the actual prize was to have lunch with us all.
Specifically you.
Yes, specifically you, Stephen.
Well, Sean's already had the pleasure of additional company of mine without you, James, obviously.
Okay. That's brute. That cuts deep, you know?
Anyway, back to Gaz Taylor. Thank you very much for writing. I think it's an excellent, we're all agreed, right? This is an absolutely excellent episode. And we have been discussing, actually, I think just last time I saw you, Sean. Last time we all saw each other, I mentioned that I think it would be helpful to do something along the lines of like, what is Freemasonry? You know, what is the journey? Why would I be interested in joining? Those are kind of a couple of questions that I often ask at our university scheme, Discover Freemasonry evenings. What is Freemasonry, and how why would I be interested in potentially joining? And so this is obviously answers such a big question for so many people. And it is also one that we can point new potential candidates towards specifically to start with if they want to. Well, we'll see how well we record it first, but yes, we can send them in that direction if they're interested.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing idea, Gaz. And again, just to reiterate Stephen's point, a good friend of mine who recently became a Mason actually gave me some feedback about the show and said, you know, it'd be great to actually have an episode for non-Masons about the process of joining. So a fantastic idea, and I can't wait, and we can't wait to get you on the show.
I think I do get asked, as I'm sure you guys do, about the challenges of recording Craftcast and the highs and the lows, as it were. But really, I think there aren't too many lows, but the challenge is really the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is trying to cater for which we're privileged to do, to cater for such a wide audience.
Yes.
In both age, well, I say both, in age, Masonic experience, life experience, interests, potential sort of membership age as well. You know, you have people who have been there for 40 years and people who have been in for 1 and people who haven't joined yet. And Mike Neville, we're here to answer the questions and to discuss things that are all things Freemasonry. So that does an excellent job, I think, of allowing us to do that. So thank you, guys.
Well, chaps, I think that's a great way to finish our first premiere episode of Series 4. Thank you for joining me virtually. And Sean, once again, I'm sorry that I didn't come to your installation, but I will make it up to you by taking you to Five Guys or something at some point.
Deal.
Classic.
Don't forget to follow us on X, UGLE_Grand Lodge. We are United Grand Lodge of England on Instagram and Facebook. And please do email us podcasts@ugle.org.uk. And with that, we will see you in our next episode. And it's great to be back with you. But for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye for now.
Craftcast, the Freemasons podcast. The podcast is hosted by Sean Butler, Stephen Watley, and James Dalton. The producer is Marta Zandri, and the podcast is edited by Trisonic.